I want you to think back to a time when your boss was really fucking getting on your nerves. Or maybe it was your coworker who was throwing you under the bus because truthfully his code sucked and he had to throw you under the bus to make himself look good and actually keep his fucking job. Maybe you're dealing with internal conflicts like this. Maybe you come home from that shitty day after dealing with that, and on top of that, your family treats you like shit. Your mother is just screaming like crazy. Your fucking dad is sick, so that just makes you sad as fuck. Your brother's an asshole. Like, maybe you're dealing with all these internal conflicts, or maybe it's simply as simple as you really want to smoke weed, so you give in. Or you really want to consume pornography, so you give in. Or maybe you really want to, I don't know, eat a ton of dog shit food and just binge. These are all internal conflicts in our head. And what these internal conflicts do is, well, self-control is a battery, pretty much. So these internal conflicts, over time, the more you have to emotionally regulate and hold yourself back, and essentially depending on the intensity of how hard you have to hold yourself back, is going to determine your ability to self-control. So there are two massive parts to self-control, as it turns out. Well, I guess three. So I'll first start by defining self-control, because everyone has a different definition of it. Self-control is, according to new research, it is not an action, it is not a verb, it is not something you actively do. It is the awareness of the internal conflict in your head. So your boss says some really stupid shit about your paycheck bouncing and how it's your fault, and you just want to tell him the fuck off. You want to call him an absolute fucking piece of shit that doesn't know how to manage his company. That is the internal conflict. That brings us to step one, emotional regulation. That is emotional regulation. You are dedicating a ton of energy to turning off a specific part of your brain that is responsible for actually regulating emotion and basically controlling yourself. You're essentially shutting off your brain so you don't do an immoral or socially unacceptable act. But the consequence of that is when you go home later that night, you give in to smoking weed or you give in to playing video games because you feel like shit, and that part of your brain that is able to control doing things that are good for you, well, you don't feel too much in control. Which brings us to our next point. I want you to think about, when do you actually give in? So perhaps you've given in when there's this emotional regulation going on and it's really intense, like just all day your fucking parent is just shitting on you, or your boss is shitting on you for things that are truthfully their fault. Well, that's gonna induce a lot of stress. And think when you actually fail, when you're super stressed out, when you're overwhelmed. What happens is that overwhelming feeling is your battery for self-control, your capacity to actually use this part of your brain and not give in. It's just not there because you're pretty much turning off your brain in order to cope with people being assholes. Think to when things fall apart. Think to when you actually give in to the coping behaviors and you buy the thing, or you smoke the weed or whatever, or you play the video game. Think, when does that happen? When you're super either stressed and you're trying to cope, or when you're emotionally drained from constantly dealing with, if you know, then you know, just draining thoughts in your mind, internal conflicts like, am I good enough, am I not good enough, things of that nature. If you spend a lot of time in your head like that, well then, my friend, you will look 6 years in the future and you will be like, wow, I've pretty much just been doing the same exact thing for like 6 years. So I need to say this point. Self-control is not actually an action. It's not a verb. Self-control is actually awareness of that internal conflict in your head, because as long as you're aware of the conflict, well then you can teeter on the edge and you can make a choice. But as soon as one of those pieces on the scale outweighs the other, well then your self-control goes out of the window and it feels like you're getting overwhelmed. And that's that feeling of you can't control yourself. This is a follow-up to a video I made initially. If you've ever found yourself operating in cycles, as I call it, where you feel like your self-control just goes straight out of the window after like traumatic events and having to process that stuff, well, that has a lot to do with emotional regulation and stress. And that stuff is the reason why you feel like you need to take days away from life, basically, just to be able to come back to a functioning state. Probably the main reason I have stunted my development for so many years, and I have just now been able to put this into words. For the last 25 plus years, I've been emotionally regulating nearly every single day, and I never knew how to describe that. I would say it was decompressing or something of that nature. But as it turns out, it takes so much energy to deal with the internal conflict, the noise going around in your head. Why do I speak to these people? Why are these people choosing me like this? Do I deserve to be? Like all these internal questions that you end up giving into in some negative way. That has basically been my life. So the way around actually living in this cycle and just wasting years of your life, we must become aware. We must become aware. When I don't want to program, go against the grain. We must be aware that we don't want to do something, right? Our monkey brain. And then we must use our upper brain and say, I know I don't want to do this. I'm going to put a half-ass effort anyways, and I'm just going to try. If you're aware that you're having that conflict and your monkey brain is trying to basically do what's super comfortable and stay homeostatic, well then you can actually make a choice. It actually feels like a choice. You don't feel like you were just giving into addictions over and over again. And then you can actually make some progress in your life. And maybe it won't happen in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. But the reality is, you will look back and you will be so happy that you started. You will be so thrilled at what life brings to you by exposing yourself to not smoking weed for a little bit and not playing video games for a little bit. If you go outside, you might learn how to cook and you might be good at it. You might actually you might love certain parts of life that you didn't really expose yourself to as a result, because you would just spend all this time emotionally regulating, recharging that battery from coping. Fuck. I hope you got something out of this. If you did, please like, comment, subscribe for me, and I love you so much. Thank you for tuning in.